I'm your host, Paulo Oriana, and we're talking about the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is a single board computer, mainly meaning it's a computer the size of a credit card that you can get for around 60 euros, the best version. The Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 gigabytes of RAM. You can get the previous version, the Raspberry Pi 3, for about 35 euros. The euro and the dollar are really close, so I'm going to refer all prices in euros. Well, you get the single board computer, then you need something like a power source for it. It can be a power bank or something to connect to the wall. This costs around 9 euros. If you're using the Raspberry Pi 4, you'll need some sort of heatsink. If you're going for the version 3, you can get away with just small heatsinks on top of the chips. The best heatsink for the Raspberry Pi costs around 26 euros, the highest tower. My favorite with passive cooling, it's a case made entirely of an heatsink. So how much would a computer based on the Raspberry Pi cost? Well, way below 100 euros in most cases. If you go for the version 3 of the Raspberry Pi, you can get it for 75 euros, something like that. Is it good? We'll see. We'll see about that in a few minutes. Let me just add that besides this gear that I've shown you, you will need some sort of monitor, so you can check the output of the Pi, and a keyboard. The Raspberry Pi Foundation sells a keyboard, but it only has both the US and the UK versions. So in my case, I'm living in Portugal. That doesn't do it. I need a regular PC keyboard or a Mac keyboard to connect to the Pi. So let's see what the Pi can do. When you get it, the default official operating system is the Raspbian Pi. You can get other operating systems into it, but basically the official one brings a ton of development systems for Python, Scratch, C, every kind of language that you can imagine. This is a Linux after all, so it basically supports everything. You get a productivity suite, LibreOffice, a word processor, a spreadsheet, a database, a presentation program. It's basically the equivalent of Microsoft Office, but free. And it works really well. The Pi isn't the fastest machine you can get, obviously, but basically it does the job, and it does it pretty well. You get internet tools, like a web browser, the open source equivalent of Chrome. It's called Chromium, and it's pretty cool. It works. You get email, graphics, so programs like GIMP. Games, you can have a ton of games in the Raspberry Pi. There's a distribution solely dedicated to arcade games and the emulation of consoles. It's called RetroPie. It's a great computer, it works. You can do video conferencing with it, basically using web-based systems. My favorite is Jitsi Meet, but basically anything that works on the web, it will work on the Pi. The camera for the Pi costs around 25 euros. What can you install on a Raspberry Pi besides Raspbian? Well, Pi Music Box, it's another distribution that basically turns your Pi into a jukebox. RetroPie is an emulation of classic arcades and consoles. You can emulate anything from the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy Advance, the arcades that you saw on arcade saloons when you were a child. And it does it pretty well, even on the Pi 3. So a $35 computer perfectly emulates all the consoles from the 80s and the beginnings of the 90s. Libelect is based on Kodi. It's a media center based on Kodi. It's great for some piracy and for watching whatever you have in your own library files. Open Media Vault is an NAS distribution. Basically allows you to share media within your network. By the way, it's pretty good. But you can install anything. Basically, there's FreeBSD and NetBSD for the Raspberry Pi, Plan 9. Even Windows can be installed on the Raspberry Pi in the ARM version. So, who uses the Raspberry Pi? Who are these computers for? Well, First of all, anyone that needs a cheap computer or a separate computer for personal projects. Most people have one computer at home, and whenever they want to try something new or install something that it's weird or they don't know very much about, having a second computer is wonderful. It allows you to have all the fun without any of the risks. Raspberry Pis require very little power, so you can power them with a power bank or something like that. And they are pretty useful when it comes to building Internet of Things stuff. Stuff like robots, stuff like magic mirrors, stuff like GoGoGate, which controls the gates in my home. And some of those projects, they mature and then they become real products. So something that starts at home with a pretty cheap computer becomes a business. For makers, the Raspberry Pi is just one of the options. There are a ton of single board based computers, but the Raspberry Pi is probably the most well supported. There are a ton of books and magazines about it, so you can get your ideas, you can get tutorials, you can get a head start, which is the hardest part, is to start something new. My favorite Raspberry Pi resources are basically YouTube. There are a ton of videos about the Raspberry Pi, about Raspberry Pi projects, about ideas of stuff to do with the Raspberry Pi, and the official magazine. It's called MagPi. The magazine is amazing. It's monthly. I subscribe to it. I love it. I read it from beginning to end every month. There are a lot of great books on Amazon about the Raspberry Pi. My favorite is Programming the Classics, which basically shows you how to do games like Bubble Bobble, Sensible Soccer. Those were amazing games. And the book shows you line by line how to code them in Python. It's really good, it's really impressive, and it's an inspiration. So you can pick it up and pretty much do whatever game you want on the Pi. Search the web for Raspberry Pi robots and you will find a lot of pre-made kits that you can build yourself and use as inspiration to build your own robot. Picking up a Pi is starting an adventure. What I'm going to do in this podcast over the weeks is show you a ton of projects, guide you by the hand to doing each one of them, showing people how to code. Get a Raspberry Pi, get it fast, because next week I will be starting with something new, some new adventure made on a computer.